Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's now time for online ethics class number 7. It's Wednesday, April 1st, 2020. We're entering into the last theoretical section of the course. Today, Wednesday, and Friday, and Monday will be the last 3 classes that will be concerned primarily with the theoretical element of our study of ethics. After that, we will pass on to a couple of controversial issues: euthanasia, abortion, and infanticide, and then we will be ready to conclude the course and review for the final exam. So today, as you can see in your notes, which by now I'm sure you printed out and have in front of you to watch the video, you see that we're going to spend a couple of classes, actually 3 altogether, discussing Jensen chapters 12 and 13. Now, after today, I'll be considering some items which are not going to be found directly in your text. So you will want to pay close attention to the second part of the notes which I sent you, which are entitled The Ontology of a Classical, Realist, or Natural Law Ethic. And that is the part which is even more complex and theoretical than the part that directly concerns chapter 12 itself. So I highly encourage you to read Jensen chapters 12 and 13 very carefully. Each day I will delete what we've already covered and just give you the notes that we have yet to cover. So we'll see how far we get today, and we'll see how far this video goes, how long it goes, that is. The first thing that we have is a kind of a complex statement there in number 1. I'm just going to read it with you to make sure that we understand exactly what's being said. If choices must be made according to the intellect's ability to accurately apprehend the good, then the question arises whether practical wisdom is a virtue of the intellect or of the will. Is it a virtue of knowing or a virtue of loving? Is it a virtue of truth or a virtue of goodness? Is it a virtue of the knower or a virtue of the doer? Remember here that the word virtue means excellence, so you can read back through that and say, is practical reason an excellence of the intellect or an excellence of the will? An excellence of knowing or an excellence of loving? An excellence of truth or an excellence of goodness? An excellence of the knower or an excellence of the doer? Is practical wisdom just practical, or is it both theoretical and practical? I think you can probably figure out what the answer is going to need to be, since I just told you that this is a major segment that is very theoretical. So while we're looking at ethics in terms of its practicality, how it practically, in a very practical way, helps us, enables us to live a better life, we also have to have knowledge that serves as the foundation of that practicality. Just to take an example from a different part of life. You might be very mechanically inclined. You might be able to take things apart and put them back together very well. If you have that inclination, if you have that skill and ability, that's an ability to do. But you know that you can't do what you need to do without understanding what you're doing. In other words, it's not a blind skill. To be mechanically inclined, to be mechanically adept is not a blind skill, nor really is any other skill, right? Sometimes we do have knowledge and not the skill. Sometimes it might seem that we have skill without the knowledge, but that is much less common than instances where we might run into someone, even ourselves, let's say, having knowledge without the particular skill that we might know goes along with that knowledge. So we're looking at the question of good judgment, which here gets the phrase right reason about things to be done, and the phrase that you can also find there on page 151, rooted in principle, applied through experience. So you've got 3 acts, you might say, that have to do with practical wisdom or prudence. The book uses the term counsel, judgment, and command. I like the terms observe, judge, and act. So what do we do when we come upon a situation which requires an ethical decision? We have to see what's going on. We have to observe. We have to analyze. We have to properly come to some knowledge about what exactly it is that is being done there. There was an alarm on my phone. After that observation, we have to come to a conclusion. We have to come to a judgment, right? We have to be judgmental, if you want to call it that, about what we should do with regard to the situation at hand. If the situation demands action, that's obviously the next step. Observe, counsel, figure it out, judge, come to a conclusion about what's the truth, and take an action. That's the practical aspect, and that is where we find the most crucial and the most intimate mixture of both the reason and the will. And this is why I've said several times, you've heard this phrase, morality resides in the will. It's the action that counts. If you observe an act, you don't do anything, right? Well, you haven't done anything. You haven't taken action. You haven't done anything right or wrong. Now, it might be wrong in some cases not to act, but certainly it is the taking of action which provides us, as it says here, with the essence of practical wisdom. If you think about that first precept of the natural law, do the good, avoid the evil. You notice it says, do the good, not know the good, not think about the good, not observe the good, do the good, right? So observe, judge, act. And then there are a few questions here with regard to what constitutes an action, right? Obviously, actions themselves constitute actions. But what about things we just think about? What about things that we just dream about? What about fantasies? What about imagination? Does that ever constitute an action? And the best answer, and we don't have time to go into great detail on this, the best answer that would have to be given there is it depends, right? It depends on what we're thinking about, in what regard, in what situation, involving what people, etc. So while normally we would not think of thoughts as actions, sometimes they may, at least to some extent, have that characteristic. What about words? Are words actions? We're not doing in the normal fashion of doing, saying to somebody, I'm going to cut your head off is not the same, obviously, as actually cutting a person's head off. But sometimes words, since they can do good or they can do harm, do in fact also seem to be actions. So it may or may not be the case that only acts themselves are actions. So what about prudence? This is a big question for all of us. How do I become better at exercising practical wisdom? How do I become more prudent? And obviously, a key in this that we've seen all along, and we're going to continue to see, is the whole concept of right desire. I can't act rightly if I don't desire rightly. Or at least, if you remember the 6 stages of continence, it's harder to act rightly if I don't also have the right desire. And this also affects other things. And so you notice some sort of comparisons here between right choices, right desires, right judgments, right desires. And you might kind of wonder, so which comes first? What follows, right? Does desire come after knowledge, or does knowledge come after desire? Does prudence presuppose that our desires are all properly put together? And the fact of the matter is, and I hate to tell you this, there's no simple, easy, clear-cut, black and white answer to these questions. Sometimes, yes, we will find knowledge following desire. Sometimes we will find desire following knowledge. Sometimes we don't know exactly which one came first. We don't know if it was the desire or the action itself. And this makes it more difficult to figure out how exactly can we get better at doing what we ought to do. Notice, and this is 5H, there's a mention of voluntarism. If reason serves the emotions, and we've seen this over and over again as we've studied voluntarism throughout the semester, if reason serves the emotions, that's the voluntaristic approach. If the emotions serve reason, that is a non-voluntaristic approach. All right? And so, referring here to pages 160 to 161, you will find some other comparisons between the virtues. Just think of the 4 cardinal virtues, or at least 3 of them, wisdom or prudence, you might say the moderation of the will, and moderation of the appetites. They all work together, and that's ultimately what we refer to as justice. So wisdom, courage, moderation, justice, all work together and in a sense are one. So when we think about courage being connected with the will, or temperance being connected with the appetites, wisdom or prudence being connected with the intellect, we know that in a sense they're all shot through with moderation. If they're all working harmoniously, we find what we call judgment. Now, that is, to a large extent, what is going on in chapter 12. There are some other elements to that, and other elements which I highly encourage you to take note of by reading the chapter. Now we're going to move on very briefly, to the ontology of a classical realist or a natural law ethic. Why talk about this, you might think? First of all, this looks really complicated. You're going to look through these notes and say, what in the world's going on here? It's not in the book. I'll explain it to you, don't worry. Why talk about it? We talk about it, why we talk about it is dealt with in these first 2 questions in A. We need to get clear about what the ground or the foundation is of the human essence. What are we as human beings? What are we essentially? Not in our particularity, our differences are clear. What are we essentially? And what's the ground of that? Where does that come from? What's that rest on? And secondly, how exactly do we go about determining the content of the human essence? What is involved in the human essence? It's one thing just to say, oh, we're all human beings, we all have the same nature. What does that mean? What activities, what elements are there to the human essence? And once we think about what those elements are, we then get to the question, which is included sort of in A2, are all of those elements continuously or always observable? Are all of those elements at work all of the time? Just think about a life, right, from beginning to end. We don't, and we are not able to exhibit all of the abilities that we have as human beings at every stage of life. You know, a simple observation of a 2-year-old or a simple observation of a patient with dementia in a nursing home will tell you that here are 2 human beings, but they don't exercise all of the possible qualities or possible skills of a human being. Likewise, if we observe someone who has some sort of a physical ailment or physical limitation or is in some sort of special needs situation, we know that that doesn't really detract from their being a human being. It really doesn't detract from the essence. But how do all these qualities fit in? What do they all mean for ethical decisions that we make with regard to human beings? Now, of the two terms there, I believe you're already familiar with the first, synderesis, right? The knowledge of the principles of ethics. That's what you get in an ethics course. You could call it a course, as I think I've mentioned to you before, a course in synderesis. The second term, metaphysics, does not have any New Age connotations, as you might be familiar with. What metaphysics means in philosophy is what are the fundamental constituents or categories of reality? How do we describe what the ultimate elements of reality are? So this relates to the question of the human essence. The question about the human essence is, in a sense, a metaphysical question, because human nature is part of ultimate reality. An important thing to note about metaphysical realities in general, and the human essence in particular, is that by nature, in this view, in the classical realist view, by nature, they're infinite. And if something is infinite, it is not completely knowable. We can know essentially what something is, we can know basically what it is, but we can't know every aspect about it. Just think of the word definition. When do we use the word definition? When we're trying to figure out how to limit a term or to limit an idea. So it's got a tricky thing, right? We're trying to study an essence. We're trying to study these metaphysical categories, which are themselves somewhat beyond our grasp. Now, on the other hand, don't confuse this with Kant's idea of the noumenal world, which is completely out of our grasp. Remember, he had that odd combination. The noumenal world was the real but unknowable world, and the phenomenal world, the world in which we live, the world that science studies, is the unreal but knowable world. We're not saying anything like that. Classical realism does not buy in to the murkiness of the Kantian formulations, right? What we're saying is there are metaphysical realities, the human essence in particular. We can know something about them. We just can't know everything about them. But we can know the important elements. Now in C and D here, I just want to briefly call your attention to these. You have, again, restated the 7 precepts of the natural law, which we saw when we studied Thomas Aquinas, so we don't need to review those in detail. And then we have a list of 9 possible names of human goods, names that constitute elements of our existence as human beings. And they work in different ways, and we're not going to study them in detail either, although it does make a fascinating study. At the top of the list, obviously, is life. If we're not living, none of these others come into play. We don't get married, we don't have a family, we don't have friends, we don't go to work, we don't have fun, we don't experience beauty, we don't learn. Integrity has to do with sort of the harmonious relationships amongst all the elements of our life. It doesn't just mean being an honest or a sincere person, but it means putting all of these elements together in such a way that we are sort of in an existential way authentic, right? That we are a consistent human being in terms of our actions and our ideas. Religion, what religion means here, it can mean traditional religion, or it can mean every human being's